Siseko, would you like to share a few words with us?
Thanks, Philo, and thank you to the organizers. I really would have wanted to be in New York with everybody to be physically present for this meeting, but unfortunately, my teaching has me at hello. So I am in South Africa and at the moment, even still grading. I'm grateful to the speakers that came before me just because of the framing of the conversation and the kind of contribution that I wish to make this afternoon on Eastern time and this evening on South African time. I want to sort of trace this conversation or sort of trace my contribution by telling a story. One of our speakers very elegantly speaks about this notion of multiculturalism, if I understand her correctly, and her contribution, and how multiculturalism kind of gives us these two philosophical options, one being dogmatism, the other, of course, being this kind of relativist position, and we sort of arrive at a compromise of pluralism according to a lot of the sort of ethical, propositional debates that we're seeing today. But this debate doesn't necessarily account for a history that I would like us to consider, a history that I think feeds quite nicely into Jean Nu's contribution, which is the history of marginalized peoples, the exploitation of their resources for the development of the global north, and how that entire history of global development subsequently leads to the current global climate challenges that we're faced with. And this particular history is one, as we all very well know, I'm situated on the African continent, maybe on the southernmost tip of the African continent, but it is a history of colonialism for Africa. And I bring this up because in many debates that we tend to have, Africa tends to sort of fall by the wayside without a conceptual understanding of what we can bring, even as we continue to be at the incredible receiving end of the decisions that are made on global fora. If you think about the impact of global climate change, at the moment we're supposed to be in spring in South Africa. Spring is supposed to have just supposed to have started, and across the country we're experiencing snowfall. And this is a country that never experiences snowfall. So we see the absolute impact of the global climate change crisis. And again, South Africa is not necessarily at the forefront of the kinds of decisions that have led us here, even though we might be the largest coal-consuming nation in terms of our energy supply. We're not at the forefront of the global decisions that are made, and yet we are on the receiving end of some of those challenges. Now, in terms of tracing the story of, historical injustices, if one can call them that, predicated on colonialism in the South African experience, be that becoming apartheid, the response that often is given, and that was given most recently in our own history, was the response of conceptual decolonization, which I find to be rather limited in terms of the kinds of options that it can give us to think about specifically global multilateralism. And so I offer the project that I work on and sort of continue to think alongside, which is the project of the Black Archive, which sort of addresses two very fundamental sustainable development goals. So colleagues will sort of forgive me here, I'll switch in between sort of the philosophical chat and some of the training that I have been subjected to, which is in political theory. And so I sort of try to bridge this gap between the conceptual work as it applies to and as it feeds into responsive policy propositions as we see them not only in our context but more so globally. Now, in relation to the two SDGs that I've just suggested, as I said, is education, of course, and then this is SDG 4. And we also respond to SDG 16, thinking about building institutions for peace and justice, not only in our local context of South Africa, but thinking about how that feeds into global systems, thinking about peace and justice. Now, in some of the work that I've developed so far, I seek to suggest this idea of contending with the contribution of African intellectual traditions. And I suggest even sort of more radically in the South African context that these contributions that African intellectual traditions can make ought to be integrated into higher education curricula. So whether a student is reading in engineering, in natural sciences, in agriculture, in philosophy, in anthropology, in history, we ought to be thinking about the kind of intellectual traditions that have existed on the African continent prior to the moment of rupture, which is, of course, the colonial moment of contact. Now, the scholarship confronts the historical legacies of apartheid and colonialism, as I've indicated, which continue to shape educational institutions and structures, not only in South Africa, but globally. If you look at the structure of the university across the world, it's the same institution. And I seek to suggest that that sameness, this kind of monoculturalism in terms of the institutional type of the university, kind of abrogates our opportunities of thinking about multilateralism, global multilateralism being informed by multiculturalism, right? Now, all the while, I wish to engage students in critical reflections about their socio-political realities rather than imposing abstract, disconnected philosophical frameworks. Now, in terms of SDG 16, the work, again, that we're continuing to do speaks to sort of advancing social justice and epistemic equity, specifically in the South African context, and thinking about how paying attention to our site specificities could potentially contribute to reimagining global discourses around multilateralism, and specifically, as we say, multilateralism informed by multiculturalism, because necessarily of the historical sort of conditions that shape South African reality of a multicultural society. Now, in thinking about social justice and equity, I wish to advance how education can be a tool for achieving peace, justice, and the entrenchment of democracy in terms of strengthening our institutions, by calling for renewed efforts to ensure that higher education institutions serve as vehicles for social change, particularly for marginalized and historically disadvantaged communities. The work that we do in the Black Archives sort of advances the proposition that democracy can become more responsive to context specificities if it accounts for the realities of those it seeks to govern. From this position, I've made the case for a post-liberal conception of democracy. Now, of course, I'll start to sort of conclude, Philo, just so that I can be able to give more time to our colleagues. I want to think about how this framework that I've just sort of given us speaks to an articulation with the South African context, and then I want to move from South Africa and sort of say, how does paying attention to the South African context build the bridges for this kind of global multilateralism that we're after? Through the promotion and dissemination of African histories and epistemologies, I suggest that the Black Archive strengthens efforts to develop a more inclusive educational system that goes beyond traditional Western frameworks. This approach contributes to lifelong learning, particularly for underrepresented communities, and addresses the fourth SDG. Given South Africa's historical complexity of racial and social injustice, I seek to suggest and advance the proposition that the Black Archives' focus on fostering mutual understanding through inclusive education plays a crucial role in peace building and reconciliation. This supports SDG 16's objectives of promoting peaceful, just, and inclusive societies, particularly in a country that remains divided along historical lines. And of course, one can read this in the context of South Africa, but also read it in other contexts as well. The sort of post-colonial societies that are more sort of similar to the South African experience, I think here of Canada specifically, I think of New Zealand, and I think of Australia, which continue to negotiate these kinds of tensions of multiculturalism, as multiculturalism intersects with inclusivity and peaceful democracies. Now, through its advocacy, the Black Archive encourages inclusive policymaking that reflects the values of transparency and accountability, which promotes multilateral cooperation by setting a precedent for other global South nations to influence global governance structures, ensuring that diverse voices are heard in shaping not only their own specific educational context, but international education and justice policies. The Black Archive strengthens multilateralism by advocating for epistemic diversity and social justice, positioning the Global South as a driver of inclusive global change. Philo, I think I can stop there and give time to our other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to I want to give the microphone to Siseko. Would you like to share some of your insight on this question?
Thanks, Philo. I was just actually typing up a comment in, corresponding with Abigail, since she's the person we see on our side here. So I've worked in the United States for quite a bit, actually, with a couple of colleagues in graduate schools in education who are also thinking about teacher education and how that, how teacher education programs in the United States affect or impact the public school system in the United States. And there's a very interesting sort of reality that one sort of brushes up against in those very spaces, which is what Brian was talking about, where the world knows a ton about the United States, and the United States knows nothing about the world. And so what often happens in those conversations where people are like, oh, we're open to learning, we're open to finding out different ways of doing things, is that those of us who come from marginal spaces are often sort of, I don't want to put this, crudely, but we're often sort of sidelined in those conversations. And yet we know how the public education systems work in the context of the United States. Some of those systems have actually been brought into our own contexts. They failed, and we have had to revise the kind of policy positions that we have held in our own contexts as a result of it. And we sort of attempt to bring that knowledge in, but that sort of cross-context pollination doesn't often happen because people who are in charge of teacher education programs, education revision, policy revision programs, as well as making a dent on the public system in the education space in the United States, are often not as willing to hear from folks who are coming from outside. But in our own context, I'll just say, something very simple. And I've written about this quite extensively, actually, about sort of acknowledging the kind of knowledge, or the experiential knowledge that students bring into our classrooms, and to allow students to tap into that as part and parcel, what again Brian is talking about, which is to say you have a conception of what it means to live a good life, even though that conception might be bogged down by certain sociocultural ideas and sociocultural definitions of what living good sort of seeks to suggest. So I think that there are those two parts. It's to acknowledge students as agential knowers in our own spaces, but secondly, to try and really deepen this cross-cultural, cross-border conversation that facilitates multilateralism. Because, as I say, there's often this kind of resistance when those of us are coming into the system because we are assumed not only to be unknowing, but if you go back to V.Y. Mudimbe's The Invention of Africa, we are assumed to be gradual, to be backward, and to be retarded. And I apologize if the language is a bit too strong, but fundamentally, that is the logic of colonialism. That is the logic of imperialism. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you.